The woman stumbled into St. George, Utah, on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 1877, her dress torn at the hem and her eyes holding secrets that would have broken lesser souls. Dust clung to her dark hair like a veil, and when she looked over her shoulder for the third time in as many minutes, Xavier Oakes knew she was running from something that terrified her more than the unforgiving desert sun. He had been leaning against the post outside the general store, watching the heat shimmer off the red rock formations that gave this territory its distinctive beauty, when she appeared like an apparition at the edge of town. Most folks who came to St. George arrived by stage or wagon train, but this woman had walked in alone, her boots leaving prints in the russet sand that told a story of desperation and determination in equal measure. Xavier straightened, his hand instinctively moving to check the colt at his hip, not because he sensed danger from her, but because whatever she was running from might not be far behind. At 26 years old, he had spent the last 8 years working cattle ranches across the territory, drifting from one outfit to another, never staying long enough to put down roots. Something about the way she moved, though, cautious but resolute, made him forget about the whiskey he had been planning to buy and the card game waiting for him at the saloon. She crossed the main street, her green eyes scanning the buildings as if trying to decide which one might offer sanctuary. The afternoon crowd was sparse, most sensible people having retreated indoors to escape the oppressive heat that could drive a person mad if they were not careful. Xavier watched as she approached the church at the far end of town, then seemed to think better of it and turned toward the boarding house instead. He should have let her go. He should have minded his own business and gone about his day. But something in the set of her shoulders, the way she held herself together despite obvious exhaustion, pulled at something deep in his chest that he had thought long buried. Before he could talk himself out of it, Xavier pushed off from the post and followed her. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, a stern woman with a kind heart buried under layers of propriety and practicality. Xavier reached the door just as the stranger was explaining to Mrs. Fletcher that she needed a room but had limited funds. "I can work," the woman was saying, her voice hoarse from what must have been days without enough water. "I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need." Mrs. Fletcher was shaking her head, not unkindly but firmly. "I have all the help I need, dear, and I cannot let rooms on credit. This is a business, you understand." Xavier stepped forward, pulling coins from his pocket without thinking through the implications. "I will cover her room," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. 2 weeks paid in full." Both women turned to stare at him. Mrs. Fletcher's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline, while the stranger's expression shifted from surprise to suspicion in the span of a heartbeat. "I do not need charity," the woman said, lifting her chin in a gesture of pride that reminded Xavier of a wild horse refusing to be broken. "Not charity," Xavier replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "Call it an investment. Mrs. Fletcher, you were complaining just last week about needing help with the repairs on the back porch. I will do the work in exchange for room and board, and this lady can assist you with whatever tasks you see fit. That way, everyone benefits." It was a transparent excuse and they all knew it, but Mrs. Fletcher had a practical streak that outweighed her curiosity. She looked between them, calculating, then nodded slowly. "Very well. 2 weeks. After that we will see where things stand." She turned to the stranger. "What is your name, dear?" The woman hesitated for just a fraction too long. "Willa," she said finally. "Willa Zimmerman." Xavier wondered if it was her real name, but he did not press. Whatever she was running from, whatever she would never name, it was clear she needed the anonymity that a new identity could provide. He extended his hand. "Xavier Oakes, welcome to St. George. Her hand was smaller than his, but her grip was firm, and he felt calluses that spoke of hard work. Up close, he could see the shadows under her eyes, the slight tremor in her fingers that suggested she was running on nothing but willpower. She met his gaze for a long moment, searching his face for something, and whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she gave a small nod. "Thank you," Willa said quietly. "I will pay you back." "No need," Xavier replied, then gestured toward the stairs. "Mrs. Fletcher will show you to your room. Get some rest. There is time enough for everything else later, Mrs. Fletcher led Willa upstairs, and Xavier stood in the entryway, wondering what he had just gotten himself into. He had learned long ago that the safest way to live was to keep moving, to avoid attachments and complications. Yet here he was, committing to 2 weeks of carpentry work for a woman whose name might not even be real. He left the boarding house and returned to the general store, purchasing the supplies he would need to repair Mrs. Fletcher's porch. As he loaded the lumber onto a borrowed wagon, he caught sight of 3 riders entering town from the east, their horses lathered with sweat, despite the heat. They rode with the kind of purpose that set Xavier's instincts on edge, and when they pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, he made a mental note to stay alert. The next morning, Xavier began work on the porch just after dawn, when the air was still cool enough to make physical labor bearable. He had been hammering for about an hour when Willa appeared, carrying a tray with coffee and biscuits. "Mrs. Fletcher thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the tray on a makeshift table he had constructed from sawhorses and a plank. "Appreciated," Xavier replied, wiping sweat from his brow. In the morning light, with her hair pulled back and her face cleaned of dust, Willa was even more striking than he had first thought. She looked younger, maybe 23 or 24, with delicate features that contrasted with the steel he sensed beneath her surface. She lingered, watching him work, and Xavier wondered if she was the type who found silence uncomfortable, or if she was working up to asking something. After a few minutes, she spoke. "Why did you help me yesterday?" Xavier considered the question while he lined up another board. "Seemed like you needed it. Most people would not have noticed, or if they did, they would have looked the other way. Most people are not as observant as they should be." Willa was quiet for a moment, then said, "Those men who rode into town yesterday, did you see them?" So she had noticed them too. Xavier set down his hammer and reached for the coffee, buying himself time to frame his response. "I saw them." "You know them?" "No," she said, but he heard the lie in the single syllable. "I was just curious." "Curiosity in a place like this can be dangerous," Xavier said carefully. "If someone is looking for you, you should probably stay inside as much as possible, at least until they move on." Her eyes flashed with something between fear and defiance. "I told you I do not know them." Xavier held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "All right, I am not asking questions, just offering advice." Willa wrapped her arms around herself despite the growing heat. "I cannot hide forever." "No," Xavier agreed, "but you can hide long enough to catch your breath and figure out your next move." She studied him again with that penetrating gaze, as if trying to understand what motivated him. "You are very calm about all this, about helping a stranger who might be in trouble." Xavier shrugged, picking up his hammer again. "Everyone has a past. Everyone has things they are running from, even if it is just themselves. I figure the least we can do is give each other a chance to start over." Something in his words seemed to reach her, because her expression softened slightly. "Is that what you are doing here? Starting over?" "Maybe," Xavier admitted. "Or maybe I am just passing through like always." Willa nodded slowly, then picked up the tray. "Well, for what it is worth, I am grateful you decided to pass through when you did." She went back inside before he could respond, and Xavier returned to his work, though his mind kept drifting to the mystery she represented. Whatever she was running from, it was serious enough that she had walked across desert country alone rather than risk staying wherever she had been. That took either courage or desperation, and he suspected it was a combination of both. The three riders stayed in town for 2 days, asking questions at the saloon and the hotel, and Xavier made sure to be somewhere nearby whenever they were around, listening without seeming to. They were looking for a woman, that much was clear, though they never gave a name or description that was specific enough to be useful. On the 3rd day, they rode out heading south, and Xavier watched them go with a mixture of relief and lingering unease. That evening, he found Willa in the boarding house kitchen, helping Mrs. Fletcher prepare supper. The older woman had clearly warmed to her new helper, because she was chatting away about the history of St. George, while Willa kneaded bread dough with practiced efficiency. The Mormons settled here back in '61, Mrs. Fletcher was saying. Brigham Young himself chose the location, called it Utah's Dixie because of the climate. They thought they could grow cotton here, though that did not work out quite as planned. Willa smiled at the story, and Xavier felt something shift in his chest at the transformation it brought to her face. She looked younger when she smiled, less haunted, and he found himself wanting to see that expression more often. "Those men left town this morning," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Headed south." Willa's hands stilled in the dough just for a second before resuming their rhythm. "That is good," she said neutrally. "Mrs. Fletcher looked between them, her sharp eyes missing nothing, but she had the good sense not to comment. Instead, she wiped her hands on her apron and said, "Xavier, you have been working yourself to the bone on that porch. Why do not you stay for supper? It is the least we can do." It was not really a question, and Xavier found he did not want to refuse anyway. "I would be honored, madam." Supper was a simple affair of roasted chicken, vegetables from Mrs. Fletcher's garden, and the bread Willa had made, but it was the best meal Xavier had eaten in months. They ate in the dining room with the 2 other boarders, a traveling salesman and a young teacher who had just taken a position at the local school. The conversation flowed around topics both mundane and interesting, and Xavier found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did anymore. After the meal, Willa helped clear the dishes while Xavier stepped out onto the repaired porch to smoke. The sun was setting behind the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that took his breath away. He had seen countless sunsets across countless territories, but something about this one felt different, more significant somehow. Willa joined him a few minutes later, drying her hands on a towel. "Mrs. Fletcher says you did an excellent job on the porch. She is very pleased." "It was good work to do," Xavier replied, exhaling smoke into the cooling air. "Keeps a man honest working with his hands." "Is that what you usually do, carpentry?" "Sometimes. I have done most things at one point or another, cattle drives, ranch work, sometime as a deputy over in Nevada. Whatever pays and keeps me moving." "You do not like to stay in one place?" Xavier considered the question. "It is not that I do not like it. I just never found a place that felt like it was worth staying for." Willa was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I used to think I had that. A place worth staying for. I was wrong." It was the first real glimpse she had given him into her past, and Xavier did not want to push too hard and make her retreat. "What made you wrong?" She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the darkening landscape. "I thought I knew someone. Thought I understood what my life was going to be. Then I learned the truth, and everything I believed turned out to be a lie." "The truth about what?" Willa shook her head. "I cannot talk about it. I am sorry." "It is not that I do not trust you. It is just that some things are too dangerous to name out loud." Xavier stubbed out his cigarette and turned to face her fully. "Listen, Whatever it is you are running from, whatever you will never name, I want you to know something. As long as you are here, as long as you are under this roof, I will make sure nothing happens to you. That is a promise." Her eyes widened, glistening in the fading light. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." "Maybe not," Xavier admitted, "but I know enough. I know you are brave enough to walk across a desert alone. I know you are proud enough to want to work for your keep rather than accept charity. I know you make Mrs. Fletcher laugh, which is not an easy feat. That is enough for me." Willa blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "I do not understand you, Xavier Oakes." "That makes two of us," he said with a slight smile. "But maybe that is all right. Maybe some things do not need understanding, they just need doing." She smiled then, really smiled, and Xavier knew he was in trouble. He had meant what he said about protecting her, but what he had not admitted, even to himself, was that his motivations were becoming less about simple kindness and more about something deeper, something he was not ready to examine too closely. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Xavier found work at a nearby ranch, breaking horses and mending fences, while Willa settled into her role at the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher had clearly decided to keep her on permanently, much to everyone's relief, and Willa proved herself invaluable in ways that went beyond simple housekeeping. She had a gift for making people feel comfortable, for drawing out the lonely and the lost with her gentle questions and genuine interest. Xavier made a point of stopping by the boarding house every evening, ostensibly to check on the repairs he had made, but really to see Willa. They fell into the habit of talking on the porch after supper, sharing stories that revealed themselves to each other in careful increments. Xavier told her about growing up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who had died when he was 15, leaving him to provide for his mother and two younger sisters. He told her about the hard years that followed, the choices he had made that were not always honorable but were always necessary, and how he had eventually left home when his sisters married and his mother passed. Willa shared less about her own past, but what she did reveal painted a picture of a woman who had been sheltered, then betrayed. She had grown up in Denver, the daughter of a banker, and had been engaged to a man her father had chosen for her. She spoke carefully about her former fiancé, never using his name, but Xavier pieced together enough to understand that the man had not been what he seemed, and that discovering his true nature had set Willa on her desperate flight. "He was involved in things," she said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Terrible things. I found out by accident, overheard a conversation I was not supposed to hear. When he realized I knew, he told me I could never leave, that I was in too deep just by knowing, but I could not stay. I could not be part of that." "So you ran," Xavier said, and she nodded. "I took what little money I had saved and left in the middle of the night. I have been running for 3 months, moving from town to town, always looking over my shoulder." "The men who came through town," Xavier said carefully, "they were looking for you. It was not a question, and Willa did not bother denying it. I think so. I could not be sure, which is why I stayed hidden. But yes, I believe they were sent by him." "Will he keep looking?" "I do not know," Willa admitted. "I hope that eventually he will decide I am not worth the effort, that I have been gone long enough that it does not matter anymore. But I cannot be certain." Xavier reached out and took her hand, a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "Then we will deal with it if it comes to that, together." Willa looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, and Xavier saw something shift in her expression. "Why are you doing this? Really?" It was a question she had asked before, but this time Xavier had a different answer. "Because somewhere along the way I stopped being able to imagine being anywhere you are not." The confession hung between them, heavy with implication, and for a moment Xavier thought he had said too much, pushed too hard. But then Willa squeezed his hand and said softly, I feel the same way. I did not expect to. I did not think I could ever trust anyone again, but you make me feel safe in a way I have not felt in a very long time." Xavier pulled her closer, tucking her against his side, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, finding comfort in each other's presence. It was the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. August rolled into September, and the brutal heat of summer gave way to slightly cooler temperatures that made outdoor work more bearable. Xavier continued working at the ranch, saving money with a vague plan forming in the back of his mind about buying land of his own, something he had never seriously considered before. Willa had become indispensable to Mrs. Fletcher, and the older woman had started talking about eventually leaving the boarding house to her, a prospect that both thrilled and terrified Willa in equal measure. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-September, Xavier took Willa on a ride out to see the red rock canyons that surrounded the town. He borrowed 2 horses from the ranch, patient mares who would not spook easily, and packed a picnic lunch that he had paid the Chinese cook at the saloon to prepare. Willa had been nervous about leaving town, worried about being too visible, but Xavier had convinced her that they would be safe in the wilderness, away from prying eyes and potential threats. As they rode through the stunning landscape, following trails that wound between towering rock formations, Xavier watched Willa's tension gradually ease. "It is beautiful," she breathed, staring up at a cliff face striped with layers of red, orange, and cream. "I have never seen anything like it." "Utah has its own kind of magic," Xavier agreed. "Different from anywhere else I have been." They found a spot near a small spring where scrubby vegetation provided some shade and spread out the blanket Xavier had brought. The meal was simple but good, and they ate while watching lizards dart across the rocks and listening to the distant cry of a hawk. "Tell me something," Willa said, lying back on the blanket and staring up at the cloudless sky. "If you could do anything, be anywhere, what would you choose?" Xavier lay down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I used to think I wanted to keep moving forever, never settling down, never being tied to one place. But lately I have been thinking maybe that was just because I had never found the right place, or the right person." Willa turned her head to look at him. "And now I think maybe I have found both," Xavier said, meeting her gaze. "I think maybe St. George could be a place worth staying for. Because of me, because of you," he confirmed. "Because for the first time in my life, I can imagine a future that is not just about surviving but actually living, building something real." Willa reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I want that too, but I am afraid to hope for it. What if he finds me? What if I bring danger to you, to Mrs. Fletcher, to everyone I care about? Then we will face it," Xavier said firmly. "Together. I am not afraid of danger, Willa. I am afraid of losing you, of not taking this chance because of something that might never happen." She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I was engaged to be married once. I thought that was what I wanted, what I was supposed to want, but I never felt for him what I feel for you. I never felt like my heart was going to burst out of my chest just from being near him. I never felt safe and terrified and exhilarated all at once." Xavier turned on his side, propping himself up on one elbow so he could see her face properly. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I am in love with you, Xavier Oakes," Willa said, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I am saying that you make me believe in the possibility of happiness again, even when everything in my life tells me I should not." Xavier cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling both foreign and utterly right on his tongue. "I think I have loved you since the moment I saw you walk into town, looking like you were ready to face down the devil himself if you had to. He kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms wrapping around his neck. It was a kiss that held promise and hope, and a future neither of them had dared to dream of, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "So what do we do now?" Willa asked, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Now we start building that future," Xavier said, "one day at a time." Together. They stayed at the canyon until the sun began to set, talking about possibilities and dreams, making plans that felt both audacious and absolutely necessary. Xavier told her about the parcel of land he had been looking at, 50 acres just north of town with a small spring, and enough grazing land for cattle and horses. Willa talked about her dream of opening a small restaurant someday, using the cooking skills her mother had taught her before she died. As they rode back to town in the gathering darkness, Xavier felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, he was not running from something or drifting toward nothing. He was moving toward something concrete and real, toward a life he actually wanted. But peace in the territories was always a fragile thing, and theirs was about to be shattered. 2 weeks after their ride to the canyon, Xavier was working in the corral at the ranch when one of the ranch hands came running up, his face flushed with exertion. "Xavier, you better get to town quick," the young man gasped. "There are men at the boarding house asking about a woman. Mrs. Fletcher sent me to fetch you." Xavier's blood ran cold. He did not need to ask which woman they were asking about. He saddled his horse in record time and rode hell for leather back to St. George, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. He arrived to find 4 men standing outside the boarding house, their horses tied to the rail. They were better dressed than the previous group, wearing suits that marked them as city men, out of place in the dusty frontier town. One of them, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes, was speaking to Mrs. Fletcher, who stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her expression set in stubborn lines. "I told you, I have no knowledge of anyone by that description," Mrs. Fletcher was saying as Xavier dismounted. The silver-haired man's expression was polite but implacable. "Madam, I understand your desire to protect your borders, but this is a legal matter. The woman in question is engaged to be married to my employer, and she left Denver without permission. He is very concerned about her welfare." "If she left, maybe she had good reason," Xavier said, stepping onto the porch. "And maybe her welfare is just fine without your employer's concern." The 4 men turned to assess him, and Xavier saw the moment they dismissed him as a threat. It was a mistake people often made, seeing a cowboy and assuming he was all brawn and no brain. The silver-haired man smiled thinly. "This does not concern you, friend. This is a private family matter." "Family matters do not usually require 4 armed men," Xavier observed, noting the bulges under their jackets that suggested shoulder holsters. "They also do not usually involve tracking someone across 300 miles of territory." The smile vanished from the man's face. "I will ask you one more time to stay out of this. We have the legal right to retrieve Miss Zimmerman and return her to Denver." "Is that so?" Xavier said mildly. "Do you have papers to prove that? A warrant, maybe?" The man's jaw tightened. "We do not need a warrant to escort a woman back to her fiancé." "Actually, you do if she does not want to go," Xavier replied. "Last I checked, women were not property that could be retrieved like lost luggage. If Miss Zimmerman wants to leave with you, that is her choice." "But it has to be her choice." The tension on the porch had drawn a small crowd, and Xavier was aware of curious onlookers gathering at a safe distance. The silver-haired man seemed to realize that the situation was not going in his favor, because he pulled back slightly, his expression becoming more conciliatory. "Perhaps we could speak with Miss Zimmerman directly," he suggested. "Allow her to hear our message from her fiancé. Surely you cannot object to that." Xavier was about to respond when he heard the door open behind him. Willa stepped out onto the porch, her face pale but composed. She had clearly been listening from inside, and she had made the decision to face this confrontation head-on. "You can deliver your message," she said, her voice steady. "But the answer will be the same as it was 3 months ago. I am not returning to Denver, and I am not marrying your employer." The silver-haired man's expression shifted, becoming harder. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Hartley has been very patient. He understands that you suffered from a temporary bout of feminine hysteria, but it is time to return home and fulfill your obligations." Willa's eyes flashed with anger. "Feminine hysteria? Is that what he is calling it? I suppose that is more palatable than admitting the truth." "And what truth would that be?" the man asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and was daring her to say it out loud. "That your employer is involved in criminal activities," Willa said clearly. "That he and his associates are responsible for thefts, fraud, and worse. That I overheard him planning something that would have destroyed innocent families, and when I confronted him, he made it clear I would be complicit in his crimes if I stayed." The crowd that had gathered murmured at this revelation, and the silver-haired man's expression became dangerous. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Zimmerman. Slander, even. Mr. Hartley could have you arrested for spreading such lies." "They are not lies," Willa said, lifting her chin. "And if Mr. Hartley wants to drag this into a courtroom, I would be happy to testify under oath about everything I know." It was a bold move, and Xavier felt a surge of pride at her courage even as he tensed, ready to intervene if the situation turned violent. The 4 men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this level of resistance. "Mr. Hartley hoped it would not come to this," the silver-haired man said slowly, "but you leave us no choice. If you will not come willingly, we have been authorized to use whatever means necessary to ensure your return." Xavier moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with Willa. "That sounds an awful lot like a threat." "And threatening a woman in broad daylight in front of witnesses is a good way to end up in the sheriff's jail." As if summoned by the mention of his title, Sheriff Dawson appeared at the edge of the crowd, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was an older man, weathered by years of maintaining law in a frontier town, and his eyes missed nothing as he assessed the situation. "Is there a problem here?" the sheriff asked, his tone deceptively mild. The silver-haired man turned to him with visible relief. "Sheriff, thank goodness. We are here to escort Miss Zimmerman back to Denver. She is engaged to my employer and left without his permission. We would appreciate your assistance in this matter." Sheriff Dawson looked at Willa. "Miss, is what he says true about the engagement?" "It was true," Willa said carefully. "But I broke off the engagement 3 months ago when I learned about his criminal activities. I left Denver of my own free will, and I have no intention of returning." "Criminal activities," the sheriff repeated, his interest clearly piqued. "What kind of criminal activities?" Willa took a deep breath, and Xavier could feel her trembling slightly beside him. This was the moment of truth, the moment when she would have to name the thing she had been running from all these months. "His name is Victor Hartley," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He owns several businesses in Denver, but his real money comes from a land fraud scheme. He bribes officials to give him advance notice of which properties are going to be seized for railroad expansion, then buys them cheap and sells them to the railroad for enormous profits. He also works with a gang that robs the homes of wealthy families while they are at the opera or other social events. I overheard him planning a robbery that would have resulted in the murder of a night watchman. When I told him I could not be part of such things, he told me I already was, simply by knowing about them. He said if I ever left or spoke to anyone about what I knew, he would make sure I was implicated as an accomplice. The sheriff's expression had grown increasingly grim as she spoke. That is a serious accusation, miss. Do you have any proof? I have names, dates, details of meetings I overheard, Willa said. I have been keeping notes, writing down everything I remember. I was hoping it would be enough to go to the authorities someday when I felt safe enough to do so. The silver-haired man laughed, though there was no humor in it. This is ridiculous. She is clearly unbalanced, making up wild stories to justify her abandonment of her obligations. Sheriff, surely you can see that. But Sheriff Dawson was looking at Willa with a measuring gaze. You know, it is funny you should mention land fraud. I have a friend up in Denver, another lawman. He has been investigating a series of suspicious property transactions for the better part of a year. Lost the trail a few months back, could not get anyone to talk. I wonder if he would be interested in speaking with you, Miss Zimmerman. The four men from Denver exchanged worried glances, and Xavier knew they were calculating their options. They could try to take Willa by force, but with the sheriff present and a crowd of witnesses, that would be tantamount to admitting guilt. They could try to discredit her, but her detailed knowledge was clearly giving them pause. This is not over, the silver-haired man said finally. Mr. Hartley has powerful friends, Sheriff. I would advise you to think carefully before involving yourself in this situation. Is that a threat against a law officer? Sheriff Dawson asked, his hand moving to rest on his gun. Because that would give me cause to detain all of you right now. The tension stretched taut as a wire, and Xavier prepared himself for violence. But after a long moment, the silver-haired man shook his head. We will be leaving. But tell Miss Zimmerman that this is not finished. Mr. Hartley does not give up what belongs to him. I do not belong to anyone, Willa said sharply, and I am not afraid of Victor Hartley any more. The four men mounted their horses and rode out of town, and Xavier watched them go with a sense of unease. The confrontation had not ended in violence, but it also had not ended the threat. As long as Hartley wanted Willa back, whether for revenge or to keep her silent, she would not be truly safe. After the crowd dispersed, and the sheriff took Willa's statement, promising to contact his friend in Denver, Xavier and Willa found themselves alone on the porch of the boarding house. Mrs. Fletcher had made tea which neither of them drank, both too agitated to think about mundane things like refreshment. He is not going to stop, Willa said quietly. Victor is not the kind of man who accepts defeat. If he cannot get to me directly, he will find another way. Then we will be ready, Xavier said firmly. You were brave today, Willa. You named the thing you were running from, brought it into the light. That takes the power away from him. Does it? Willa asked, her voice breaking slightly. Or did I just make things worse? What if he comes after you now, or Mrs. Fletcher, or anyone else I care about? What if I have put everyone in danger by being here? Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. You listen to me. You did not create this situation. Hartley did with his crimes and his threats. You are the victim here, not the villain, and anyone who cares about you would rather face danger alongside you than let you face it alone. Willa buried her face in his chest, and he felt her tears soaking through his shirt. I am so tired of being afraid, she whispered. I am so tired of running. Then stop running, Xavier said gently. Stay here. Stay with me. We will figure this out together. She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. What if I said yes? What if I said I wanted to stay here forever, build a life with you? Could we really do that with this hanging over us? Yes, Xavier said without hesitation. We can do that. We will do that, starting right now. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He had been carrying it for a week, waiting for the right moment, and this might not be the romantic proposal he had imagined, but it felt right nonetheless. Willa Zimmerman, I know your real name might be something different. I know you have a past that is complicated and a future that is uncertain, but I also know that I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. I know that I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night for the rest of my life. I know that whatever comes, I want to face it with you. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it. It was not fancy, but it was real, and he had spent 3 weeks' wages on it. Will you marry me? Willa stared at the ring, then at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. Xavier, I cannot ask you to tie yourself to me when my life is such a mess. You are not asking, I am offering. And it is not charity or pity or obligation. It is love, pure and simple. So what do you say? For a moment he thought she might refuse, might push him away out of some misguided attempt to protect him. But then she smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Oakes. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, pouring all his love and hope and determination into that single gesture, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. Mrs. Fletcher appeared in the doorway, her eyes suspiciously bright. Well, it is about time, she said tartly. I was beginning to think I would have to lock you two in a room together to make you see sense. They laughed, and the tension that had been coiled in Xavier's chest since the confrontation began to ease. There would be challenges ahead, he knew that. Hartley was not going to give up easily, and they would need to be vigilant. But they would face those challenges together, as partners, as husband and wife. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at the end of town. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Mrs. Fletcher, Sheriff Dawson, the ranch owner Xavier worked for, and a handful of other townspeople who had become friends over the past months. Willa wore a dress that Mrs. Fletcher had helped her make, cream-colored with lace at the collar, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Xavier had picked that morning. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Xavier felt as if his entire life had been leading to this moment. He kissed his bride with all the love in his heart, and the small congregation cheered. After the ceremony, they held a modest celebration at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing that lasted into the evening. Xavier had never been much for social gatherings, but watching Willa laugh and dance, seeing her finally able to relax and enjoy herself without constantly looking over her shoulder, made every awkward conversation and forced smile worth it. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Sheriff Dawson pulled Xavier aside. I heard back from my friend in Denver, he said quietly. He is very interested in speaking with your wife, says the information she provided lines up with what he has been investigating. He is building a case against Hartley, but it is going to take time. How much time? Xavier asked, his protective instincts flaring. Months, maybe longer, the sheriff admitted. These things move slowly when you are dealing with powerful people, but he assured me that he is taking it seriously. He is also going to try to get a restraining order to keep Hartley away from Willa. Will that stop him? Sheriff Dawson shrugged. Maybe, maybe not, but it puts him on notice that she is under official protection. That might make him think twice about sending more goons after her. Xavier thanked the sheriff and returned to Willa, who was helping Mrs. Fletcher clean up. He took the plates from her hands and set them aside, then pulled her close. "Let us go home," he said, and the word felt strange and wonderful on his tongue. Home. They had a home now. A small cabin at the edge of town that the ranch owner had agreed to let them rent at a reduced rate in exchange for Xavier's continued work. The cabin was modest, just 2 rooms with a small porch and a view of the red rocks in the distance. But Willa had made it warm and welcoming with curtains she had sewn and rugs she had bargained for at the general store. As they stepped inside on their wedding night, Xavier saw it with new eyes, seeing not what it was but what it could become. A place to build a life, to raise a family, to grow old together. He made love to his wife that night with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and sated. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Willa traced patterns on his chest with her fingertips. "I never thought I could be this happy," she murmured. "After everything that happened, I thought I would spend the rest of my life afraid and alone, but you changed that. You gave me hope again." Xavier kissed her forehead. "We gave each other hope," he corrected. "I was drifting before I met you, going through the motions of living without really being alive. You woke something up in me that I thought was dead." "What was that?" "The ability to care about something more than just getting through the day," Xavier said. "The ability to imagine a future that was not just survival but joy." Willa snuggled closer, and they fell asleep in each other's arms, the cool desert night air drifting through the open window. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Xavier's life. He continued working at the ranch, but he also began making plans to buy the 50 acres he had his eye on. Willa settled into her role as his wife, dividing her time between helping Mrs. Fletcher at the boarding house and making their cabin into a true home. She started a small garden, coaxing vegetables from the arid soil with patience and determination, and she experimented with recipes that she dreamed of serving in her own restaurant someday. There were no further visits from Hartley's men, though Xavier remained vigilant, always aware of strangers in town and potential threats. Sheriff Dawson kept them informed of the progress of the investigation in Denver, and slowly, piece by piece, a case was being built that would hopefully put Hartley behind bars. In January of 1878, as winter settled over the territory with surprising gentleness, Willa told Xavier she was pregnant. He was in the barn mending tack when she found him, her face glowing with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "Are you sure?" he asked, setting aside the leather strap he had been working on. "As sure as I can be," Willa replied. "Mrs. Fletcher helped me figure out the timing. If I am right, the baby should come in late summer." Xavier pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed with emotion. A child, their child. The idea was both terrifying and wonderful, a responsibility he had never imagined taking on but now wanted more than anything. "How do you feel about it?" he asked, searching her face. "Scared," Willa admitted. "But happy. So happy, Xavier. I want this. I want to have your baby, to start a family with you. I just hope that by the time the baby comes, the situation with Victor will be resolved." "It will be," Xavier promised, though he was not sure he believed it himself. "One way or another, we will make sure our child is safe." News of the pregnancy spread quickly through the small community, as such news always did, and Willa found herself the recipient of advice, gifts, and good wishes from every corner of St. George. Mrs. Fletcher was beside herself with excitement, already knitting baby clothes and planning to help with the birth. The ranch owner's wife, a motherly woman who had raised 6 children of her own, took Willa under her wing, teaching her everything she knew about pregnancy and child rearing. As Willa's belly grew with the passing months, Xavier found himself falling even more deeply in love with her. She bloomed with pregnancy, her face fuller, her movements slower but no less graceful. He loved watching her rest her hand on her stomach, talking to the baby they had created together, singing soft lullabies in the evening light. Spring arrived with a profusion of wildflowers across the desert, and Xavier finally had enough money saved to make an offer on the 50 acres he had been coveting. The negotiations took several weeks, but in April, the land officially became his. Their land. He brought Willa out to see it on a Sunday afternoon, helping her down from the wagon and watching her face as she took in the gently rolling terrain, the spring that bubbled up from the rocks, the view of the mountains in the distance. "It is perfect," she breathed. "Xavier, it is absolutely perfect. I am thinking we could build the house there," he said, pointing to a slight rise that would give them a commanding view of the property. "Close enough to the spring for easy water access, but high enough to avoid flooding if we get heavy rains. We could start with something small, just a few rooms, and add on as we need to." "When can we start building?" Willa asked, her excitement palpable. "As soon as I can get the materials and round up some help," Xavier replied. "I am thinking we could be moved in by the time the baby comes, if we work quickly." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, making plans, dreaming out loud about the life they would build here. Xavier could envision it all so clearly. A sturdy house with a wide porch, a barn for horses and cattle, fields for crops, maybe a small orchard. And children, lots of children, running through it all, their laughter echoing across the land. That vision sustained him through the grueling work of building their home. He called in favors from everyone he knew, and a dozen men showed up on a Saturday morning to help raise the frame. They worked through the heat of late spring and early summer, and by July the house was substantially complete. It was not fancy, but it was solid and well built, with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a living area with a fireplace for the winter months. They moved in on a Saturday, carrying their modest possessions from the cabin in town to their new home on the property. Willa was 8 months pregnant by then, moving slowly and tiring easily, but she refused to rest until every last item was in its place. "This is ours," she kept saying, running her hand over the walls, the furniture, the windows that looked out over their land. "This is really ours, Xavier. No one can take this away from us." He understood what she meant. After months of running, of hiding, of being afraid, she finally had something solid and permanent, a place that belonged to her in a way that nothing else ever had. 2 weeks after they moved in, Sheriff Dawson rode out to their property with news. Victor Hartley had been arrested in Denver on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit robbery. The evidence that Willa had provided, combined with the testimony of other witnesses the Denver authorities had tracked down, had been enough to secure an indictment. Hartley was in jail awaiting trial, and his assets had been frozen. Willa cried when she heard the news, months of fear and tension finally releasing in great, shuddering sobs. Xavier held her, letting her cry herself out, feeling his own relief so profound it made him light-headed. "It is over," Willa whispered against his chest. "It is really over." "It is over," Xavier confirmed. "You are safe now. We are safe." Their son was born on a hot August night in 1878 with Mrs. Fletcher and the doctor in attendance. Xavier paced the living room while the women worked in the bedroom, every cry from Willa making him want to burst through the door and demand to know what was happening. But he forced himself to wait, to trust that the women knew what they were doing. When Mrs. Fletcher finally emerged, her face tired but smiling, and told him he had a healthy baby boy, Xavier felt his knees go weak with relief. He was allowed into the bedroom where Willa lay propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Meet your son," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with love. Xavier approached slowly, almost afraid to touch something so small and fragile. But when Willa placed the baby in his arms, showing him how to support the head, Xavier felt something fundamental shift inside him. This tiny person with his squished face and waving fists was his son. His and Willa's, a miracle they had created together. "What should we name him?" Xavier asked, unable to look away from his son's face. Willa smiled. "I was thinking Thomas Oakes. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." The first months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still required constant attention and care. Xavier learned to change diapers, to soothe a crying infant, to function on a few hours of broken sleep. He watched in awe as Willa nursed their son, as she sang to him, as she seemed to instinctively know what he needed before he even cried. They fell into a rhythm as a family, their days structured around Thomas's needs, and the work required to keep their small ranch running. Xavier hired a young man to help with the heavier labor, allowing him to spend more time with his wife and son. Willa began talking again about her dream of opening a restaurant, and Xavier encouraged her, suggesting they could add a room onto the house specifically for that purpose. By the time Thomas was 6 months old, crawling around the living room and babbling nonsense that his parents pretended to understand, Xavier could barely remember his life before Willa. The years of drifting, of working one job after another with no real purpose, seemed like they had happened to someone else. This life, with its routines and responsibilities and profound joys, was the only one that mattered now. On a cold January evening in 1879, as they sat by the fire with Thomas asleep between them, Willa said, "I want to tell you something." Xavier looked up from the piece of wood he had been whittling into a toy horse for Thomas. "What is it?" "I am pregnant again," Willa said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I know it is soon, but I am happy about it. I want Thomas to have siblings close in age, to never feel alone the way I did growing up." Xavier set aside his whittling and pulled her into his arms, careful not to disturb their sleeping son. "That is wonderful news, the best news. You are not worried about how we will manage." "We will manage," Xavier said confidently. "We always do. Besides, I like the idea of this house being full of children, full of noise and chaos and laughter." Their daughter was born in September of 1879, a tiny thing with a full head of dark hair and her mother's green eyes. They named her Sarah, and she proved to be the opposite of her brother in temperament. Where Thomas had been calm and easy, Sarah was fussy and demanding, keeping them awake at all hours with her lusty cries. "She knows what she wants," Willa said one exhausted morning, rocking Sarah while Thomas played at her feet. "She is going to be a force to be reckoned with when she grows up." Xavier, who had been up half the night walking the floor with his daughter, could only nod in agreement. But despite the exhaustion, he would not have changed a thing. This was the life he had chosen, the life he and Willa had built together from nothing, and it was more precious to him than anything else in the world. The years passed, marked by the small milestones of family life. Thomas took his first steps and spoke his first words. Sarah grew from a fussy infant into a determined toddler who followed her older brother everywhere. The ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to a respectable spread with cattle, horses, and crops that Xavier sold at the market in town. Willa eventually opened her restaurant, operating it out of a building in St. George that Xavier helped her purchase and renovate. It was a modest establishment, seating only 20 people, but her cooking quickly earned a reputation for excellence, and soon people were traveling from surrounding towns to eat at Willa's. She hired help so she could balance the restaurant with her duties at home, and Xavier marveled at her ability to manage it all with grace and determination. In 1881, news reached them that Victor Hartley had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison. The trial had been something of a sensation in Denver, with Hartley's crimes exposed in lurid detail for all to see. Several of his associates had also been arrested, and the land fraud scheme had been dismantled. Willa received a letter from the prosecutor thanking her for her courage in coming forward and explaining that, without her testimony, the case might never have been brought to trial. She read the letter aloud to Xavier, her voice steady but her eyes bright with tears. "It is really over now," she said. "He cannot hurt us any more." "He never could," Xavier replied, pulling her close. "You were always stronger than him, Willa. You just needed to realize it." They stood on the porch of their home, looking out over the land they had made their own, and Xavier thought about how far they had come. From that first day when Willa had stumbled into St. George, desperate and afraid, to this moment, standing together as partners and equals, they had built something remarkable. A life, a family, a future that was everything he had never dared to dream of. As the sun set behind the red rocks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Xavier pulled his wife closer and thanked whatever fate or providence had brought her into his life. He had protected her without a reason, had offered help to a stranger simply because it felt like the right thing to do. And in return, she had given him everything he never knew he wanted: a home, a purpose, and a love that would last a lifetime. Their third child, another boy they named Henry, was born in 1882, followed by another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1884. The house that Xavier had built expanded to accommodate their growing family, with rooms added and porches extended, until it bore little resemblance to the simple structure he had first constructed. It was a home filled with laughter and love, with the chaos of children and the quiet moments between husband and wife that made everything else worthwhile. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved working with the horses. Sarah was as fierce and determined as they had predicted, already declaring at 5 years old that she was going to be a rancher like her father and run the whole operation someday. Henry was quiet and observant, content to sit and watch the world around him with wide, curious eyes. And Elizabeth, still a baby, smiled at everyone who looked at her, spreading joy wherever she went. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1887, Xavier took Willa back to the canyon, where he had first told her he loved her. They left the children with Mrs. Fletcher, who despite her advancing years was still sharp and capable, and rode out into the red rock country on a crisp autumn morning. The canyon looked much as it had that first time, timeless and eternal, and they spread out a blanket near the same spring where they had picnicked a decade earlier. Willa leaned against Xavier's shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching hawks circle overhead and lizards dart among the rocks. "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked suddenly. "Taking me in that day, getting involved in all my problems?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "Not for a single second," he said finally. "You gave me a life I never thought I would have. A real life with meaning and purpose and more love than I knew existed in the world. How could I ever regret that?" "I was so afraid when I came here," Willa said softly. "I thought my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days running and hiding. I never imagined I would find you." "We found each other," Xavier corrected, "and we built something beautiful out of the ruins of our old lives." Willa turned to look at him, her eyes bright with tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "I love you, Xavier Oakes, more with every passing year. You are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that you were standing outside that general store when I stumbled into town." "I love you too," Xavier said, kissing her forehead. "Now and always." They stayed in the canyon until the sun began to set, then rode home to their children and their life, both of them filled with gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and the love between Xavier and Willa deepened with time. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, celebrated births and mourned deaths, and through it all, they remained each other's constant, the anchor that kept them grounded no matter what storms came their way. Thomas grew into a capable young man who took over much of the daily operation of the ranch, allowing Xavier to slow down as he approached his 50th birthday. Sarah, true to her childhood declarations, showed an aptitude for business that rivaled her father's, and she began handling the financial side of the operation with shrewd intelligence. Henry discovered a love for carpentry, following in his father's footsteps in a different way, and soon was in demand throughout the territory for his skill in building furniture and structures. Elizabeth, the baby of the family, inherited her mother's gift for cooking and began working at the restaurant as soon as she was old enough. By 1895, Xavier and Willa were grandparents, with Thomas having married a girl from town and started a family of his own. They lived in a small house on the property, close enough to help with the ranch but far enough to maintain their independence. Watching Thomas with his own children, Xavier was struck by how quickly time had passed, how the baby he had held in his arms was now a father himself. One evening in the spring of 1897, Xavier and Willa sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the land they had made their own. They were in their 60s now, their hair streaked with silver and their bodies moving more slowly than they once had, but their love had not diminished with age. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by decades of shared experiences and unwavering partnership. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Xavier asked, taking Willa's hand in his. "How could I forget?" Willa replied with a smile. "I was terrified, exhausted, convinced my life was over. And then you appeared, this stranger who offered help without asking questions or demanding explanations." "I did not need explanations," Xavier said. "I just knew you needed help, and something in me responded to that need." "You protected me without a reason," Willa said softly, echoing the phrase that had become a touchstone in their relationship. "You took a chance on a woman who was running from something she would never name, at least not right away. You gave me safety when I had none, hope when I had lost it, and love when I thought I would never trust anyone again." "And you gave me a reason to stay in one place," Xavier replied. "A reason to build instead of drift, to put down roots instead of running. You gave me a family, a purpose, a life that means something." They sat in companionable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in rhythm. Around them, the ranch bustled with quiet evening activity. They could hear Thomas calling to his children, Sarah discussing business matters with her husband, Henry hammering away in his workshop, Elizabeth singing as she prepared dinner in the kitchen. This was their legacy, Xavier thought. Not just the land or the buildings or the successful businesses, but the family they had created, the love they had nurtured, the life they had built from nothing but determination and hope. He had protected Willa without a reason all those years ago, and in doing so had found his reason for everything. "No regrets?" Willa asked, squeezing his hand. "Not a single one," Xavier replied, pulling her close. This life with you is more than I ever dared to dream of. It is everything." As the night deepened and the stars multiplied overhead, they remained on the porch, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The cowboy who had protected without reason, and the woman who had run from something she would never name, had become so much more than their origins suggested. They had become partners, lovers, parents, and grandparents. They had become each other's home. And as they finally stood to go inside, Xavier looked back at the land one more time, at the house filled with life and love, at the legacy they were leaving for their children and grandchildren. He thought about that hot July day in 1877 when a desperate woman had stumbled into St. George, and how one simple act of kindness had changed both their lives forever. It had been worth it. Every challenge and every triumph, every moment of fear and every moment of joy. Because in the end, they had each other, and that was all that truly mattered. Their story had begun with running and protection, but it had become something far greater. A love story for the ages, set against the wild beauty of the Utah Territory, proof that sometimes the best things in life come when you least expect them, and that protecting someone without reason can become the greatest reason of all.